Hi everyone, and welcome back to Liminal Space. Today I'm in discussion with Felicity Gerry. Felicity is a barrister and QC, originally from the UK and now based in Australia, who specialises in representing the world's most vulnerable people, including in the fields of human trafficking, modern slavery, sex trafficking, torture, terrorism, war crimes, and female genital mutilation, with a specific interest in issues related to women. Felicity is also an educator, public speaker, teacher, university lecturer and mentor, and is a powerful advocate of the rights of prisoners and other vulnerable people, especially during this COVID-19 period. And last week she was awarded Barrister of the Year at the Australian Law Awards 2020. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome Felicity to Liminal Space. Hi Felicity.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Pleasure, thank you. And huge congratulations for last week.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice. At the time, I thought it was just a bit of fun. They had a virtual ballroom, and I went along with some colleagues from Deakin University. But actually, receiving it was lovely. It's quite hard to belong to a new place, so I worked quite hard to fit in, and it was very nice to be awarded for some of the interesting things that I've done over the last year. You know, I'm not saying I'm the best barrister in Australia, but I did have a pretty big year. So I was very proud to get the award.
Oh, great. And I'm glad were you able to celebrate, or we're in lockdown now? Or was it a virtual
Well,
celebration?
yeah, no, about 3 days later, it was my daughter's 18th birthday. So we saved the celebrations until then. So we've actually had a 21st in lockdown for my son and an 18th in lockdown for my daughter. So we've done quite a bit of celebrating, really,
Right.
making the best of lockdown, as
Yeah.
best that we can anyway.
Yeah. And so how long have you been in Australia? When was your move from the
Oh,
UK?
it's 8 years now. Yeah, 8 years. And we went to Darwin first. So we went to Darwin for a year, and it's turned into 8. And after 5 years in Darwin, my son and I drove down the Stuart Highway. My husband and daughter flew, but my son and I did a road trip all the way down across Australia, and we moved to Melbourne. And once we arrived in Melbourne, I said, well, why haven't we lived here? And I sort of fitted in quite well. So I don't think we're going anywhere now.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's probably the cliche question, the obvious question, but how did you get into, human trafficking, smuggling, genocide? These are not everyday things that myself and probably most others can even contemplate. So what was your in?
Oh, look, I've always been noisy and interested in issues relating to women. Even at school, I had a fairly dynamic headmistress. I didn't do so well at school. She left halfway through, and I think that sort of changed it. But she used to stop in the middle of the school song, and Jerusalem would be the song that we sang. And there's a moment when it says, I shall not cease from mental fight. And she used to always stop at that point in the hymn and say, now then, girls, never stop the fight. So she sort of taught us to be challenging, and I was always pretty noisy and liked challenging things. And the biggest challenges come from representing vulnerable people who nobody cares about. Prisoners are sort of bottom of people's list when it comes to human rights often. So I've tended to channel that into the work I've done as a barrister over the last nearly 26 years. So I've always chosen the cases or the issues that are probably the most difficult. And that's where I felt I'm needed, because it's where you have to have the loudest voice, and I'm noisy. And of course, it's always fascinating. So I'm never bored. So that's probably the straight answer to your question, is that I've found situations where I'm fascinated by what I do, and I'm allowed to be noisy, or at least if I'm not allowed to be noisy, I do my best to bring to people's attention those complicated issues. So look, as a barrister, I've got a reputation. People would say, oh, this one's got your name on it. And that would be a brief that was either a complicated area of law or a difficult client, and most often than not, both. And at the beginning, I both prosecuted and defended, which often people don't understand. So I prosecuted cases where women and children were abused, perhaps long before many other people did, and I can remember being laughed at the prospect that I would actually be able to successfully prosecute, for example, the rape of a sex worker, which was a very bizarre place to be. And now I defend cases involving terrorism, where no one considers that you can defend those types of cases either. So I think there's also something about when people say, "Oh, how can you do that?" So I think, just watch me, and I do it. And I think that's why I feel needed in those places where other people think you shouldn't be doing it. So, look, that involves terrible issues, always terrible issues that vex the community. And I hope combining that with being a professor also helps to educate people about how complex the issues are.
So it seems that you've found your life calling, which most of us struggle with, right to the end. Is that fair enough?
That. Yeah, it's a nice thing to say, but look, somebody told me the other day that there's a phrase, a pracademic, and a practitioner who is also an academic. I tend to call myself a hybrid. But what I can say is the work that I do as an academic, the research that I do, I think really complements the work I do as a barrister. And I've always done that. I've always been obsessed with what's the law, how can it change if it needs to change. So I'm not so interested in what the law is, but what it should be. And you can't wait for a case. You may never get the case that could change that area of law. Occasionally I have done, but you might never get the case. So you have to then make submissions to government or join an organisation to try and help get that across the line. So in the Northern Territory, for example, I worked with health experts on changing the law on reproductive rights. And in England and Wales, I worked with community and health experts on changing the law relating to female genital mutilation. And I still do that work. It's situations where I've never had a brief. So I do work as a barrister supporting groups and organisations where the law needs to change or they're seeking to change the law in a way that I consider to be appropriate. So I help out. So look, that's really where I'm coming from. I can't wait for a brief to change what I think needs to be changed. And sometimes people will disagree with me, but at least then you can have the discussion and debate.
Yeah. And I've heard you mention this word cross, that you get cross, and this is what motivates you into action. Can you explain this a bit more?
Yeah, I think I've probably got a filthy temper at times. I do get cross. Not nasty cross, I just get frustrated cross, I think. But the law is so slow. When you read, as I have had to do in some cases, 500 years of law, and that's law that stems from England into Australia, and the threads of those laws through precedent, when sometimes they drift off and people are impacted by judicial decisions quite significantly. So when you read centuries of history, you realise we haven't actually come very far. We still round people up and lock them up, and find ways to create rules that punish people very significantly without looking at either other methods of punishment, but more importantly, whether or not they really are criminally responsible. And that's most interesting in the context, for example, of human trafficking victims who commit crime. So somebody who is compelled to commit a crime by the actions of others is the area that I'm significantly interested in. Now, there really are no frameworks in Australia that are sufficiently protective for those people. We see them as criminals, but if people could understand that sometimes trafficked persons are trafficked in organised crime, which is well recognised across the globe, then we can start to think about whether they're criminals at all, actually. If they've been exploited as a result of disadvantage or sex trafficking or violence, abuse, duress, then, or even just abuse of vulnerability because they are living in poverty and disadvantage. They've got no other option but to get on a plane and go be a maid in Saudi Arabia, and someone puts drugs in their suitcase. In all of those circumstances, I like to think about that as explaining to the world, either in a case or through the research and advocacy that I do, that these people are not criminals at all, and how we can move to a world where we don't prosecute people rather than constantly prosecuting people. And that's what I mean by choosing the hard, challenging cases. They're the ones that the general public, for a start, don't tend to understand. Politicians don't tend to understand. They don't get the headlines in the media unless you can have some amazing result, which I must say we have had. And therefore you have to sort of plug away and keep going. And these sorts of issues I've spoken about for over a decade now, longer, and done cases in that context. So yeah, I suppose I have. Taking on challenges, particularly in relation to how the law affects women, is, it's a good path to travel.
Yeah. And, you mentioned growing up, this your experience at school, but what about your family life, or, did you have this sort of sense of social justice that was drilled into you perhaps as a child that you've kept through your life?
Yeah, I don't know about that. Look, my mum was a social worker for a bit and a school secretary for a bit, and my dad had a great sense of justice, and he was a good debater. He was a bit noisy too, and so we were. And I was an only child, so there's certainly intellectual discussion at home. I don't think we were particularly radical. I don't see myself as particularly radical, but I can see disadvantage where that victimisation comes from the state very well. And because I don't think I fulfil a stereotype, and neither of my parents did, I think that gives my voice a sense of uniqueness. People don't quite know where to put me. I've always tried very hard not to be pigeonholed. And I think both my parents are the same. My father's dead now, but both of them, you find very hard to pigeonhole. And my father's mother was a huge influence on me, and she was much the same. People that you don't quite know where to put them, and that makes you listen. Who is this person? Where do they come from? What are they talking about? So I don't know that they specifically said, off you go and fight the good fight, but they certainly allowed me to be unusual, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So I always say, it's quite hard being me, but it does allow me to have a pretty unique voice, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, you mentioned trafficking, sex trafficking, and in the same sentence you mentioned Australia. I know a lot of Australians, a lot of people in the so-called Western or developed world would think that trafficking, sex trafficking, smuggling, slavery is something that happens somewhere else, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, look, it's a huge myth. Everybody thinks slavery stopped with the ending of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. But all that did really was no longer make it lawful to own a person. It didn't actually stop the selling and exploitation of people. So we see people being exploited in labour exploitation, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, and trafficking in organised crime. There are various typologies that we absolutely recognise. So if you phrase it in another way, you think about, I don't know, farm labourers being exploited. They don't have to come from abroad. Some do, some don't. But you can start to see how we could visualise exploitation in labour and on farms, or in fishing, or in the rag trade. So in clothing, people being exploited domestically and overseas. Sex trafficking is a real problem because we don't really look at the difference between autonomous choices for sex work and where people are being trafficked in sex work. There's a sort of knee-jerk reaction to sex work that it's somehow not a choice that people make, or everybody's trafficked, without actually looking at the issues. And then obviously trafficking and organised crime. If you think about children being used to supply drugs, for example, we can see that as exploitation. And in my view, it's exactly the same as child soldiers. And everybody understands what a child soldier is and the levels of exploitation that occur to force someone into being a child soldier. So once you start to use that type of language, people start to think about, oh yes, you know, I understand it a bit better. If you don't use the legal language, then you can start to encourage people to stop and think about, well, firstly, is that an issue in Australia? And secondly, what is the legal framework for their protection, which is where I come in. So you have to sort of research whether it's going on. And when you start to look at the figures in Australia, the AFP have a website, a web page that talks about human trafficking and how they're trying to prosecute traffickers and protect victims. And the numbers are really low. And I'm pretty confident they don't count the numbers of people who are sitting in prison, who in my view shouldn't be there, who are there because they were trafficked by others. So the numbers are not collected particularly well. There is a consultation for a new national action plan, and there's certainly policy to protect trafficked persons in Australia. But it's another example of where the law is very, very slow to move. And frankly, because traditionally women were property, I think it's particularly slow to move for women and for issues that largely affect women. That's not to suggest men are not trafficked persons, because they commonly are in labour exploitation. I've certainly done cases involving men as well as women. But because it's an issue that substantially affects women, I think that contributes to why it's so slow to change, because you've got a system that is largely male. So it fires you up, I suppose, makes me cross. But I think people are becoming more aware, and that's not just because I'm working in that space, but because others have worked out that there are ways to implement international commitments to the protection of trafficked persons wherever they pop up. And Australia is just a bit slow to the party.
I'm really curious as to, in your cases, you obviously have, I'm assuming, very close contact with people at times that have gone through very difficult experiences and so forth. And I'm a documentary filmmaker, and there's always this sort of discussion or debate about how close or not to get to, the people that you're filming with. Is this something as well that you have to deal with on a regular basis, sort of getting very close to the people that you represent?
Look, we haven't, particularly defending, you have a unique opportunity to go into a prison or to meet someone who comes into your office who is at their lowest point. Whatever's happened to them in their lives has led to them being in that situation. And if they're coming to see me or I'm going to see them in prison, it's usually a really serious allegation. Murder, the sorts of human trafficking issues that I've talked about, terrorism. Recently, I've done 3 big back-to-back trials in terrorism. So you're seeing people at their most extreme, if you like. You're seeing the state at its most extreme, its power to lock people up for a very long time, even before trial, frankly, when they're meant to be presumed innocent. So it's a unique opportunity where you get to see what most people don't. So then publicly you can talk about the issues, but you don't betray the confidences of your client. So the person that you're seeing has to have confidence in you that you will keep their case confidential insofar as that's necessary, and deal with the way in which their case needs to be presented. And you have to explain, look, I can only do that as a matter of law. I can't, sympathy, if you like, exists. Of course it does. You meet people in terrible circumstances and it's just horrendous, and you can't empathize, because certainly I've never been in that position, but you can be sympathetic and knowledgeable and helpful. But actually the challenges you can take on their behalf are only the ways in which the law allows you to challenge, or where you want to argue that the law is wrong and you want to change the law. So your relationship is never the same as somebody who is a friend, because you often have to say, no, we can't do that. Or we're going to try this, but I'm going to tell you that your chances of success are low, but we'll give it a go. Here's what I think the law should be. We'll use your case to try and get there. So you're always in a position of a position of power and responsibility over someone else's life when they've got to a point where they really have no power over their own lives. So it just isn't the same as a relationship of friendship. And look, some clients are more likable than others, but if you also engage in that assessment of people, I mean, that's really patronising, isn't it? You know, so in order to do what I do, you have to sort of treat everybody with dignity and respect, and with levels of dignity and respect for their case. There's a very old-fashioned expression about putting yourself in your client's shoes. In order to understand their case, you have to really look at it from your client's perspective so that you can present it on their behalf in court. So it's not for you to judge. The jury will judge that person, the judge might judge that person, but it's for you to present the arguments on their behalf and to present what they say is their side of the story. And that story has to have as much legitimacy as the prosecution story in order for a jury or a judge to make a decision. So you have to engage in their case sufficiently to give their arguments sufficient legitimacy to be considered by the jury, so that the jury verdict, hopefully, is sound one way or another. So it's a very different relationship from making friends with people. That said, you do enjoy the company of the people that you meet. And I'm certainly still in contact with the mums of a couple of clients. You know, you might make friends with people who are associated with the person that you're looking after, if you like. So mums whose children are falsely accused in some way, could be anybody. You know, you're not judging them by the fact that their child happens to be in prison, falsely accused of something, or potentially falsely accused, depending on what the circumstances and what the law are. So I've always been affected by how cases affect the mums, I suppose, because I am one. But you can keep it all very separate, and you do a case and then walk away. That's the oddest part. You know someone better than they know themselves for the period of time that you're doing your case, and then the case is over, and if there's nothing else you can do, if you can't take it any further, you do just walk away. And they don't want to see you again. It's a reminder of the terrible part of their life. They don't want to know you again. They wanted you there to present their case. You don't engage in the same way as friendship. You acknowledge that you have mutual respect, and then you walk away and you never see them again unless they pop up as a client on another occasion. So it's a very odd and strange relationship, but it's a bit like doctor and patient in a way. You don't actually really make friends with your doctor. You just know that there's a doctor that you like better in the practice, and you tend to go to that doctor, and you might go to the same doctor for 25 years with repeat problems, but they're not really your friend. Very occasionally people make friends with their own doctor, or they're in the same social circles as their own doctor, but it's pretty much the same.
You said something that's really fascinating to me. I'm really interested in sort of psychology of people, in behaviour, in what makes people do things, basically. And also this idea of, are there bad people or evil people, or are there just people with bad ideas or evil ideas? I know this isn't directly to do with the work that you do, but you've said that you get a really particular insight into people, perhaps knowing them more than they know themselves. Do you have anything that you can contribute to this idea about, are there bad people or just bad ideas?
Look, I tend not to judge people, as I say. I don't think that's my role. I'm very interested in the legal issues that their cases throw up. I'm very interested in them being treated with dignity and respect by institutions, so that they're properly treated by medics, by the courts, by the prison services. But I suppose the answer to your question is, there was a fantastic sort of Woodhouseian barrister that I used to see in court years ago, 20 years ago, who was called Ross Fitzpatrick, and he was known as Mungo. And he was a mate of George Carman's, who was a very, very famous silk in England that did all the big defamation cases, and was recently represented in the documentary about Jeremy Thorpe, which was fascinating. So George Carman, very, very well known and a very colourful character. And Mungo Fitzpatrick was his friend. And the drink got to Mungo, and he didn't quite rise to the echelons that George Carman reached. But he was a beautiful, beautiful advocate. And you could go into court, and even when he was at his most difficult in his personal circumstances, because he became an alcoholic, you could hear him on behalf of clients give these beautiful stories to try and reduce their sentence, having regard to their life experiences. And he was so wonderful to listen to, and very colourful English language. But he would often start with the same line. It would sort of get him going. And he'd say, some cases are bad, some cases are mad, and some cases are sad. And this case is, and then he'd choose one of those, and off he'd go. And you'd listen to this wonderful oratory on behalf of his client. And I have no doubt it impacted on the sentence that the judge would give, even when the judge had heard it all before. You know, it was so wonderful to listen to, and he really would understand his client, and it would be bespoke to the person he was talking about that day. There would be information in there that would be solely relate to that person, that case, those issues. And it was worth hanging on to see how the art of advocacy can be so persuasive. And there's a sense of categorizing people. You know, is it a mental health issue? Is it something that was truly a dreadful choice? Or is it something that's just as a result of their personal terrible circumstances, mad, bad, sad? Then you can categorize people, but really only at the point that there is a judgment to be made. So I like to move that into the trial process, that we ought to differentiate in the sense of guilt, that there's less criminal responsibility that somebody has mental health issues or has a sad life in the sense of being a trafficked person, for example. I like to think that could lead to not guilty. But at the moment, we tend to deal with it in the sentencing space. So, look, you can probably categorise a case based on the evidence, but I tend not to do anything more than that. I'm simply not a psychologist. It's interesting to understand the drivers behind cases. And I suppose it's really interesting to try and change minds, particularly in the context of terrorism, for example. Everybody thinks terrorism is awful, and actually they're often just a bunch of young blokes who have had their heads turned by some very good propaganda, which is not the same as somebody who is waging a direct war against states. So that's also capable of being mad, bad and sad, and somebody's been groomed or influenced to take part in something they might not otherwise have done. So I think that's how I like to explain it, that there are the art of what we do is very, very powerful. It takes significant experience and ability. And what we're doing is advocating on behalf of a particular individual, but also as to how that fits within this bigger system where the state has so much power. And, you know, challenging power is always fun.
Well, I think you're not going to be short of work challenging powers in the next little bit. I didn't want to focus on COVID-19, but the reality is that we're living in this period, unprecedented times. You and I, right at this minute, are probably only a few kilometres away, but we're currently in lockdown. Not so much in an Australian sense, but just generally in a global perspective. What are your main concerns, of power and things like this that could be affected in the next months, years due to COVID?
Yeah, look, I think there are three categories. I think the use of emergency powers needs to be understood as to how draconian they are. It's not a rule of law, it is a rule of power, that you can order people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be doing. And that includes going home and staying at home and not travelling more than 5 kilometres or whatever the current state of the rules are. Anywhere in the world, we're all subject to these massive restrictions. You know, I work internationally. We've mentioned genocide and torture. Most of that work has been academic or advisory. But, you know, if I was called upon to go and work in an international case, I'd have to ask permission from the Australian government to go, which is a very restrictive power that exists for me personally, and other people have been significantly restricted. The people in the towers in public housing in Melbourne suffered 500 police officers outside their door containing them as almost a form of detention. So we can think of examples of, from our own perspective and from other people's perspective, particularly vulnerable people, that show that these are very, very grave powers that the state has. So we've then, where your worries come in are the over-criminalisation of people. So that if you do something, you're going to be fined, or you're going to be charged, or we're going to make some new laws that if you spit on someone, you're going to prison for life, or whatever it is. For a public health, otherwise, what is a public health issue that, in my view, shouldn't create criminalisation at all? Control of people during a pandemic, but not necessarily criminalising people. So you've got the first issue is you're setting up systems that risk the criminalisation of large proportions of the population. So it's not just about infringement notices, but a good example is if someone gets an infringement notice, if they challenge it and say, well, look, I had a reasonable excuse, it's just that the police officer didn't think it was reasonable, but I did. And if you go to court and the judge agrees with you, all fine, infringement gone. Or if the judge doesn't agree with you, then the judge could give you a bigger fine, and you come with some form of criminal record. So what happens is then that people don't challenge. And worse than that, often people don't know that they have a challenge, because the public information, isn't it, that actually you can do all these, here's the rules, here's the directions, here's the exceptions. So you can go out up to 5 kilometres, you can go to the supermarket, these are the exceptions. But what the government doesn't say is, plus you can do other things if you have a reasonable excuse, because that reduces the amount of control that the government have. So you very rarely hear politicians or police officers saying, oh yeah, you know, also if you've got a reasonable excuse, we'll exercise a discretion. You do hear it. We've asked our officers, you know, to listen to explanations and so forth. I'm not saying that's not been said at all, but it's not as loud as you can't do this. So there is a real risk that people are criminalised, that they don't understand that they can challenge, or they don't want to challenge because of the risks. And it's a public health issue. So I have a real problem with these being supported by criminal sanctions. Second is discrimination, the way in which, and these are not in order of importance, they're just the second one that I think is really interesting from a legal perspective. Are these powers being used in a discriminatory way? And certainly there's evidence from New South Wales that policing was targeted at particular communities, not because that's where the rates were high of infection, but because that particular community was targeted. And there's some evidence of that. I don't think we've got similar figures in Victoria, and I haven't done the data, but certainly in relation to the public housing in Victoria, you've got public housing with a very high proportion of Black and ethnic minority people. In prisons, you've got a very high proportionate number of Indigenous people in prison. So you start to think about terrific ways in which people who are Black and ethnic minority groups, disabled, vulnerable in some way, mental health issues, all of those people who are at risk of being more vulnerable in a powerful, largely white colonial state, are being affected by those powers. So you have to, and women in particular, so we've got issues around domestic violence, you know, how are people being affected by those powers, and is it discriminatory? And what facilities are there for those people who are affected by those powers? So criminalisation, discrimination. And then, of course, there's the care of people. So in ensuring that they have rights to life and health. So in many circumstances, it's arguable, at least, that the state has taken on a duty of care. But even if it's not a specific duty of care that comes with a remedy, what you're really asking a state to do is make sure people have rights to life and health. And those rights are not derogable. You can't say, well, David, you can have your life, but Felicity, you can't have yours. We need to try and have processes where everybody has the rights to the highest attainable standards of health, because if they don't, your right to life is affected. So those are what we call as lawyers non-derogable rights. You can't choose not to provide frameworks to ensure the highest attainable standards of health and the rights to life. And that becomes, it's not a balancing exercise, it becomes an exercise in taking positive steps. So what we see is positive steps to stop people getting COVID-19. We get that. We're trying to look after everybody's health and life because we don't want them to die of COVID-19. But then putting people in prison in isolation for 23 hours a day, 24 hours a day, quarantine and isolation affects their rights to life and health. Similarly, in public housing, keeping people in a form of detention, including at times building a cage for exercise. That didn't last very long, inhuman and degrading treatment. But suddenly you can see how the actions of the state in trying to deal with COVID-19 can actually significantly harm people. And we can't just say, well, that's necessary in a pandemic, because you're harming people. You're not giving them the right to the highest attainable standards of health. And that might include something as simple as providing culturally appropriate food. It's not rocket science. You know, to assume a duty of care, or at least, or have a duty of care, or at least assume you have a duty of care, ensures that we're doing our best for everybody in the community. And that, then you have to think about how long those restrictions have to be in place, and how you can harm a lot of people if those restrictions are in place for a long time, and whether they can be justified as proportionate and necessary if numbers are low. And these are really hugely difficult choices for the state to make. But there are choices that can not involve the police and actively involve the community. And as I've often said, at the moment, what we tend to see is the state working with the police, working with health, but we don't see the community. And it's perfectly easy to engage the community. There are community representatives. Most areas have a mayor, if that's the suitable access, but you have community legal centres, the ombudsman is now involved. There's really no, a royal commission, for example, is not really the answer, because that's after something's happened. I recommended very, very early on in relation to prisons having a task force. Again, it's not difficult. You have a task force with representatives from police, state, health, community, and that it fulfills that idea that diverse people make for good decisions. So that's what we haven't seen. We haven't seen upfront strategic planning that involve members of the community. And then you start to see mistakes and errors, and that can harm people's health. And that's sadly where the lawyers come in, because ultimately people's only access to justice is to instruct a lawyer. And if it had all been done up front from the first place, you wouldn't need a lawyer. So that's where I take the view that prevention is better than cure. You know, if you can engage communities at the front end with strategic planning, it's much more likely to have a healthy outcome for everyone.
Yeah.
So I think certainly for us sitting in Victoria now, for us to go back in on a second lockdown was really, really hard, and nobody's going to want to go back in again. And maybe we wouldn't have had to go back in again if there'd been strategic planning involving the community, because it largely seems to be the result of frameworks not working around incoming people from abroad, which is manageable if managed properly. So look, if these are mistakes because it's such an extraordinary situation, they're not mistakes that should be running any longer, but they are mistakes that may have significantly affected the health of some people, and we have to have regard to that. Yeah. You can't go around in your small world ignoring the harm that can be caused to other people. So, you know, I buy into wearing masks, buy into lockdown. I absolutely think those things are the right things to do, providing they're not having a significant effect on the health of people individually or generally. And the way in which we can assess all of that is to review things. So a small review on criminalisation, for example, in England and Wales, they reviewed every single charge under certain legislation, and under one piece of legislation, they found that 100% of charges were unlawful. Now, that didn't require individuals to go to court and take the risk of being criminalised. Of course, they wouldn't have been if they'd gone to court, because it would have been discovered that they were unlawful, but people are too frightened to challenge or don't know that they have a challenge. So if you review every prosecution, every infringement notice across Victoria, my bet would be you'd find some that were unlawful. And that doesn't mean that individuals have to challenge the state. It's actually the state being proportionate and accountable. That's not to suggest that there isn't good management going on. It's simply that in the absence of community involvement at that same level as police, health and state, there are inevitably going to be mistakes, and some of them will be big and some of them will have affected people's lives. My sneaking suspicion of 500 police officers outside public housing is that there will be some people that are fundamentally traumatized by that. It looks like something out of a horrific movie.
Yeah.
So that's what's really interested me in lockdown. You know, what's the law? How's it being applied? Why isn't it being applied in that way? This is how the law should work. Why isn't it being done in that way? And sometimes you get a case, and sometimes you get to just do public advocacy like this podcast with you.
Yeah.
So that's really where I'm coming from in lockdown. Is partly it's given me the opportunity to be a keyboard warrior on issues like human trafficking, genocide, torture, you know, domestic responsibility for international torture, those sorts of questions around, are we looking in our own backyard as to who's responsible for genocide and torture abroad? Those are really big issues, so I can catch up on some of the work that I want to do there while I'm not in court, but also those very direct issues as to how the community are affected by the very powers that are supposed to be protecting us from a virus.
Yeah.
So yeah, really hard work, really complicated, really interesting, and things to shout about, and capable of being shouted about even when you're in lockdown. Yeah. So right up my street, really.
I know time is so precious and valuable. Do you have time for me to just ask one more question?
Go on then, one more.
So I was reading last night, United Nations Population Fund released a report called Unlocking the Lockdown, and it predicted that there'd be 13 million child marriages and a whole increase of trafficking and smuggling due to issues of closed borders now with COVID, and also many people who can't make a living being forced to go abroad, and perhaps, you know, getting involved in these trafficking and smuggling rings, let's say. Is this something that you're actively thinking will be a big issue and problem in the next years as well?
Yeah, I think you have to accept that the UN Population Fund knows what they're talking about. And there is massive exploitation across the world. The numbers for human trafficking and the profits being made, whether that's in organised crime or corporate supply chains, are just huge. The amount of profit being made out of people in poverty is well researched, well known. I use those words deliberately. They come from an International Labour Office report in 2014. The exploitation of people is the gravest problem that we have globally. It is modern slavery. People are enslaved in different ways and exploited in different ways across the globe all the time, whether that's in Australia or outside of Australia. Unless you have systems and processes that do those three things, prevent, protect and prosecute, unless all those three are working to the equivalent level so that we protect people even when they've committed a crime, if they're a trafficked person, or if they're the result of migrant smuggling, that we don't prosecute them for paperwork and document offences, and we work out are they in fact asylum seekers, and are they worthy of protection, and should we have a system in place? Millions of people are going to be displaced by climate change, so we need to get processes in place now. And some of them are not rocket science. I was talking the other day about statelessness. There are millions of people across the world who are labelled stateless, but it really actually means they haven't got a document that says where they're from. That just needs a process. I think you have to listen to the UN Population Fund. That's not political. It's a practical reality that's very, very well researched. Doesn't, of course, hit the front pages. Ought to in many respects. What are we going to do about these people that belong to us? Would be a much better question than what are we going to do about these people that we perceive don't belong to us.
Yeah.
Let's have a process that works that out. And it's a kindness, isn't it, that we don't leave people in camps in terrible conditions where their children die, that we don't have people exploited in factories that then collapse so they die, that we don't have children working when they're young and they should be educated, that we have access to education and family and good health that doesn't include gendered conduct like female genital mutilation, or pressure on young women to have labiaplasty because they want to look like people in porn channels, sort of all sorts of those terrible issues that arise, that we can have people who make autonomous choices about difficult issues, whether it's labelled FGM or some other sort of health consequence. So look, these are really complicated issues, but I think you do have to listen to the research. And it's always easy for someone who denies the research to get a platform, but that isn't really balance. That's just somebody ignoring what is so well known. And I suppose we can end on my concern at the attitude to experts in many ways, that social media seems to have so much weight against proper research that is undeniable when you actually read it. And I think maybe the problem is that people don't read enough into headlines, or that they don't always click on the link and read the full document. So I think if what comes out of my little podcast with you is somebody reads the UN Population Fund and it makes a difference to how they approach things, that's why I think podcasts are important and filmmaking is important. I've always found it very, very hard to get any sort of program over the line which doesn't portray women as victims. Let's have a program about female genital mutilation or human trafficking or slavery where women are constantly in the paradigm of victim. Or let's find an individual who's doing something amazing, instead of actually, should we find an individual who's doing something terrible? How do you make a program about a system? It's very hard. But ultimately, having these types of conversations or program making that raises issues that allows people to be aware makes an enormous difference, and more difference than I can make on my own, being one shouty person. And and if that's clicked on social media and people read it, then even if it's one person whose ideas are altered, they don't have to agree with me, but they go off and have a think about how complicated issues are and how they might be solvable and what they can do to contribute to that. It's a bit like recycling, isn't it? It takes a long time for people to engage, but eventually we'll hopefully have a lot less waste. And that it's really the same. Let's not waste people or waste communities. So that's, I suppose, a bit school marmish and a bit mumsy, but that's where I come from, really.
It's absolutely perfect. It really, for me, is a big pleasure to be able to have these chats with you and, give you this very, very humble platform to spread your words. And I'm going to link that report in this podcast so people can follow up on that, as well as your website. And you inspire me, and I know that people watching and listening can't help but be inspired by your words, but more importantly, your actions. So thank you so much for
it's very nice of you. Look, if people feel that they want to do anything that I do, start by reading. It's as simple as that, really. Just read and read and read and read. I'm obsessed with reading things, writing about things, saying what I think. Sometimes I'm wrong, and that doesn't matter either. And you know, find your place, you know, find what you're interested in. And it can be as little as putting a different book on your book club list, or marching when you want to march. Your little bit that contributes to changes in the world. You don't have to be, I call myself occasionally an activist lawyer just because I find that expression quite entertaining, and people don't think of me as a radical activist in that sense. So I wind people up by saying it sometimes, but you know, your little bit that can contribute is just the same as washing the milk bottle out and putting it in the recycling. You know, some people do a little bit more than others, but that's because for me, I'm in a profession where I have the weight of that profession behind me, the weight of a university behind me, and the weight of the research behind me. So where people are in the sort of position that I am, I hope that they use it in the same way that I do. They may not be as noisy as me, but there's a lot of lawyers across the world that are doing their best for communities. Yeah. So I suppose it's quite nice to end on loving lawyers rather than hating them.
Loving lawyers and loving cross and noisy lawyers, and
and loving annoying lawyers even better. Yes.
Thank you so much, and yeah, all power to you. And maybe some months down the track we can have another chat to go deeper in some of these threads.
Yes, of course. Look forward to speaking to you again, and good luck with your filmmaking and podcasts. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, bye, Felicity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.